Looking back now, I can see the signs, but at the time, I was oblivious. Marriage has a way of making you trust so completely that the obvious red flags just blend into the background. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those rare, quiet days when life slows down just enough to let you breathe. My wife, Claire, was out with friends, as she often said. I was home, catching up on a book that had been gathering dust on my nightstand. The calm before the storm, I suppose. It started with a notification on her laptop. Claire was notoriously careless about leaving her devices logged in, a habit I never gave a second thought.
Until that day.
I wasn't snooping, I swear. I had no reason to. But the message popped up so suddenly, so obviously incriminating, that it was impossible to ignore. It was from a name I didn't recognize, Mark. The message read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Last night was amazing. Miss your smile already." I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting into knots. At first, I thought I must have misinterpreted it. Maybe it was a joke? A misunderstanding? But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. This wasn't a friend. This wasn't innocent. This was something else entirely. My hands shook as I clicked on the message thread. The conversation was vivid, intimate in a way that left no room for doubt. They talked about stolen moments, about how he made her feel alive again. Each word was a stab in the chest. I could barely breathe. I wanted to stop reading, but it was like staring at a car crash. You can't look away. The more I scrolled, the more the illusion of my perfect marriage crumbled. There were pictures, too. Selfies of them laughing, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked so comfortable, so happy, like I didn't even exist. I sat there in silence for what felt like hours, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was my life unraveling right in front of me. All the anniversaries, the late-night talks, the plans for the future, they felt like a cruel joke now.
How could she?
The house suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, each second dragging me further into despair. I didn't cry, I was too numb for that. Instead, I started piecing together everything that had led to this moment. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she'd been pulling away from me emotionally. It all made sense now, a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. And then there was a noise. Her car pulling into the driveway. She was home. My heart leaped into my throat as panic set in. What was I supposed to do? Confront her? Pretend I hadn't seen anything? Claire walked through the door, her smile bright and easy, like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek and asked what I wanted for dinner. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at her, at this person I thought I knew. She noticed, of course. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile faltering. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Nothing. Just a headache." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went to the kitchen to start cooking. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of what I'd uncovered sank in. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was the end of everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the life we'd built together. For the rest of the evening, I went through the motions, pretending everything was normal while my mind raced. I needed a plan, a way to confront her without letting my emotions take over. But one thing was clear. My life had just been split into two parts, before and after. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I felt like a stranger in my own home, in my own bed, next to the woman who had betrayed me. And so, the first cracks in the foundation of my marriage began to spread. The next morning, I woke up before Claire. Not that I'd slept much. I just lay there all night, staring at the ceiling, replaying those messages in my head. It felt surreal, like I'd slipped into someone else's nightmare. But it was real, and the weight of it pressed down on my chest like a boulder. Claire stirred beside me, her usual groggy smile forming as she reached out to touch my arm. I flinched before I could stop myself. Her hand froze in midair, her eyes searching mine. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and sleepy. I forced myself to nod, mumbling something about needing coffee. I didn't trust myself to say more. Downstairs, I paced the kitchen, gripping a mug of coffee that had gone cold while I debated my next move. The confrontation had to happen, but how? Part of me wanted to explode, to scream at her for what she'd done. Another part wanted answers, needed answers, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. Claire came down an hour later, dressed for the day in her usual casual style that once made me feel so lucky to have her. Now it felt like a mask, hiding the person she really was. "You're up early," she said with a yawn, grabbing her own cup of coffee. "Anything wrong?" I set my mug down and took a deep breath. This was it. "Claire, we need to talk." Her body stiffened, but she quickly masked it with a nervous laugh. "Sounds serious. What's going on?" I gestured to the table, and we both sat down. My hands felt clammy, and my heart was racing, but I pushed through. "Yesterday," I started, "I saw something on your laptop." Her face immediately changed. Her eyes darted away, her smile disappeared, and her posture became defensive. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice already laced with irritation. I pulled my phone from my pocket, where I'd saved screenshots of the messages. I slid it across the table without a word. She stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at me, her face contorting into something I hadn't expected, annoyance. "So what?" "You went through my messages," she snapped. I blinked, stunned. "That's what you're focusing on? Not the fact that you're cheating on me?" She rolled her eyes. "I'm not cheating, okay? Mark's just a friend. Those messages, they were a joke. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "A joke," I repeated, my voice rising. "You call sneaking around and saying you can't wait to see him again a joke? Do you think I'm stupid, Claire?" Her tone turned icy. "Well, maybe if you paid more attention to me instead of spending all your time working, I wouldn't have to talk to someone else to feel appreciated." That hit me like a punch to the gut. Was she trying to blame me for this? "Don't you dare turn this around on me," I said, my voice shaking. "You had a choice, Claire. You could have talked to me if you were unhappy. Instead, you lied. You betrayed me." She sighed, leaning back at her chair with a look of exasperation.
"Fine," she said.
"Yes, I've been spending time with Mark. But it's not what you think. He's just someone I can talk to. You're always so distant these days." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice firmer now. "I read the messages. I saw the pictures. This isn't just talking, Claire." Her expression hardened. "What do you want me to say? That I made a mistake?" "Fine. I made a mistake. But it's not like I've slept with him or anything." I didn't believe her. The messages had been too intimate, too suggestive for her claim to hold any weight. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked. Her silence was deafening. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "I can't sit here and listen to you lie to my face." Claire jumped up too, blocking my path. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "Out," I said. "I need space to think." "Michael, wait," she said, her voice softening as she grabbed my arm. "We can work through this. Please, let's just talk." I looked at her hand on my arm, then up into her eyes. For a moment, I saw the woman I married, the one who promised to love me for better or worse. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the betrayal. "I don't know if we can," I said quietly, pulling away. As I walked out the door, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and it was time to start figuring out what came next. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion. They came in waves, leaving me exhausted but unable to rest. I kept replaying the confrontation with Claire in my mind, dissecting every word, every lie. I didn't know what to do or where to start. Divorce? Counseling? Revenge? None of it felt right. Or maybe all of it did. Then one evening, I got a message from an unfamiliar number. "Hi, my name is Irene. I'm Mark's wife. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to shut this whole thing out, and pretend it wasn't happening. But another part, the part that needed answers couldn't resist. I replied, "Yes. What do you need?" Her response came almost instantly. "Can we meet? There are things you need to know." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop a few miles away. When I arrived, Irene was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee in front of her, untouched. She looked tired, like someone who had cried herself dry. "Michael?" she asked when she saw me approach. I nodded, and she gestured for me to sit. "Thanks for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, sitting across from her. "But here I am." She gave me a weak smile, then got straight to the point. "I found out about Mark and your wife a few weeks ago," she said, her voice steady but low. "He denied it at first, but eventually he confessed. I didn't know what to do, so I started looking for you. I thought you deserved to know." Her words hit me like a freight train. While I had suspected the worst, hearing it confirmed was a different kind of pain. "He admitted it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "He said it's been going on for months. At first, he claimed it was just emotional, but..." She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't think that's true. There's too much evidence to believe that." Irene pulled out her phone and showed me messages, pictures, and call logs that mirrored what I had found on Claire's laptop. It was undeniable. "I don't understand how they could do this," I said, shaking my head. "How do you betray someone you're supposed to love like that?" "I've been asking myself the same thing," Irene said, her voice trembling. "We have a child together. I thought we were happy." Her words made my chest tighten. A child. This wasn't just about two people, it was about an entire family being torn apart. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. "Don't be," Irene replied. "This isn't your fault. It's theirs." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging between us. Eventually, Irene spoke again. "I'm not here to make things harder for you. I thought you deserved to know the truth. And if there's anything I can do to help, I will." Her offer caught me off guard. I had been so consumed by my own pain that I hadn't considered the idea of working with someone else to navigate this mess. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe if we work together, we can figure out what to do. Hold them accountable. Protect ourselves." It made sense. If Mark had admitted to everything, then Irene had information I didn't. And if Claire was still lying, then maybe together we could uncover the rest of the truth. "Okay," I said after a moment. "Let's do it." For the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of hope, not for my marriage, but for myself. Maybe this wasn't the end of a story. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. As we exchanged contact information and parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort. In Irene, I had found someone who understood my pain, who was walking the same path. We were two people left in the wreckage of our spouses' choices, and together, we would figure out how to move forward. The uneasy partnership Irene and I formed turned out to be a lifeline. She had a sharp eye for details, a trait she claimed came from years of juggling work and raising her son, Alex. Over the next few weeks, we pieced together a timeline of the affair. The more we uncovered, the more I realized how deeply Claire and Mark had deceived us. Irene and I decided to consult lawyers. If Claire and Mark were going to manipulate the narrative, we needed to be prepared. The first meeting with my lawyer was sobering. Divorce wasn't just about signing papers. It was a battlefield, especially when emotions and money were involved. "Has your wife made any moves to hide assets or complicate things?" my lawyer asked, flipping through a notepad. "I don't think so," I said. "You'll want to keep an eye on joint accounts, credit card statements, anything unusual," he said. "And be prepared for her to spin the situation in her favor. Adultery doesn't always weigh as heavily in court as you might think." I left the office with a pit in my stomach. Despite being the wrong party, I felt like I was the one under a microscope. Claire's version of the truth. Claire, of course, had her version of events, and it was as predictable as it was infuriating. She claimed I had been emotionally distant for years, that I worked too much, and that she felt neglected. It wasn't a complete lie. I had worked long hours trying to secure a future for us. But neglect? That wasn't fair. She also tried to paint her relationship with Mark as a momentary lapse in judgment, insisting it was over. When I challenged her, she deflected, saying things like, "You're only focusing on my mistakes, not the cracks in our marriage that led to this." Her lack of accountability stung. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the refusal to admit fault, to own up to the hurt she'd caused. Irene wasn't faring much better. Mark had taken a similar approach, trying to paint himself as the victim of a failing marriage. We drifted apart, he told her, conveniently ignoring the fact that he'd been the one who strayed. A new challenge. The legal battles soon began to take their toll. Claire filed a counterclaim in the divorce, accusing me of being emotionally unavailable and demanding a larger share of our assets. She even tried to suggest that I had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage by not prioritizing her needs. Irene faced a similar fight. Mark, despite his infidelity, sought joint custody of their son. The idea of Alex being shuffled between households infuriated her, and she was determined to prove that Mark's choices made him unfit to be a full-time parent. Our legal teams coordinated, sharing evidence that would strengthen both cases. Irene and I provided each other with emotional support, venting over late-night phone calls or quick coffee shop meetings. We became each other's sounding board, our shared frustration and heartbreak forging a bond neither of us had expected. The web of lies. As the divorce proceedings unfolded, more lies came to light. I discovered that Claire had been siphoning money from our joint account to fund her outings with Mark. Dinners, trips, even gifts. Irene uncovered similar financial betrayals in her own marriage. But it wasn't just about the money. Claire had been telling mutual friends that I was controlling and cold, trying to sway them to her side. It felt like she was rewriting history, turning our marriage into something unrecognizable. Some friends distanced themselves, unwilling to take sides. Others, thankfully, saw through her manipulation. Still, the damage was done. Every time I thought I'd reached my limit, Claire found a way to twist the knife a little deeper. The bond with Irene. Despite the chaos, there were moments of light. Irene and I leaned on each other in ways I hadn't expected. She introduced me to Alex, a quiet but perceptive 8-year-old who immediately asked, "Are you my mom's new boyfriend?" I laughed awkwardly while Irene turned bright red. "No, sweetheart," she said, ruffling his hair. "Michael's just a friend." Alex shrugged and wandered off, leaving Irene and me in an uncomfortable silence. But moments like that reminded me there was still good in the world, even in the midst of all this pain. We weren't just surviving. We were starting to rebuild. Irene showed me what resilience looked like, and I tried to offer the same to her. Together, we were stronger than we were alone, and that thought kept me going. But deep down, I knew the hardest battles were still ahead. As the weeks turned into months, life started to find a strange new rhythm. The divorce proceedings were still ongoing, and the tension between Claire and me had only grown. Every interaction felt like a performance, her trying to paint herself as the victim, me trying to keep my anger in check. It was exhausting. But outside the courtroom, something unexpected was happening. My bond with Irene grew stronger. What had started as a partnership born of shared pain was slowly becoming a source of comfort and stability. Rebuilding routine. One evening, Irene called me. Her voice was hesitant but warm. "I need a favor," she said. "Alex's school has a parent and child event next week. I don't want Mark there, but Alex asked if you'd come with us. He's been talking about you nonstop since you met." I hesitated. I'd never been great with kids, and the idea of stepping into a pseudo-parent role, even temporarily, was daunting. But Irene sounded so hopeful, and the thought of letting Alex down didn't sit right with me.
"Of course," I said.
I'd be honored. The event was simple, a picnic at the park with games and activities for the kids. Alex lit up when he saw me, running over to show me the kite he'd made. Irene smiled, her face relaxing in a way I hadn't seen before. "You're a natural," she said later, as we watched Alex dart across the field with the other kids. "I doubt that," I replied, laughing. "But he makes it easy." That day was a turning point. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was part of something good, something worth holding on to. Finding strength. As Irene and I spent more time together, we began to share pieces of ourselves that had nothing to do with our failed marriages. She told me about her dream of opening a small art studio, something she'd put on hold when Alex was born. I shared my love of woodworking, a hobby I'd neglected in the chaos of my career and marriage. We encouraged each other to revisit those passions. Irene started sketching again, her dining table covered in papers and pencils. I set up a small workshop in my garage, the smell of sawdust bringing back memories of simpler times. It wasn't just about distracting ourselves, it was about rediscovering who we were outside of the relationships that had defined us for so long. Claire's desperation. Meanwhile, Claire's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began showing up unannounced, leaving notes on my car or sending long, rambling texts late at night. At first, I ignored her, but it quickly became clear that she wasn't letting go. One night, she called, her voice slurred. "I miss you," she said. "We can fix this, Michael." "I know we can." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Claire, we've already had this conversation. You made your choices, and I'm moving on. You're not perfect either," she snapped, her tone shifting. "You think you're some saint, but you weren't there for me when I needed you." It was the same argument she'd been using for months, and I was done entertaining it. "Good night, Claire," I said, hanging up. Her desperation didn't end there. She started spreading rumors about Irene, claiming our friendship had started before the affair was exposed. It was a weak attempt to deflect blame, but it stung nonetheless. A growing affection. Despite Claire's attempts to stir up drama, Irene and I found solace in each other. Our friendship deepened into something more, though we were careful not to rush things. One night, after a particularly hard day in court, Irene invited me over for dinner. It was nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt like a feast after the stress of the day. As we sat at her kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting shadows on the walls, I realized how comfortable I felt around her. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Like I could trust someone." Irene looked up from her plate, her eyes soft.
"Me neither," she said.
"But I'm glad we found each other." It wasn't a grand declaration or a sweeping romantic moment. It was simple, honest, and exactly what I needed. A new purpose. Spending time with Irene and Alex gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about getting through each day anymore. It was about building something new. One weekend, Irene asked if I could help her build a bookshelf for Alex's room. What started as a simple project turned into a day of laughter and teamwork. Alex insisted on painting the shelves himself, covering them in bright colors and little handprints. When we finished, Irene stood back, admiring our work. "You've made him so happy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "So have you," I replied, meeting her gaze. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The pieces of my life that Claire had shattered were slowly being replaced with something stronger, something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Life was beginning to feel stable again, but stability, as I'd learned, is fragile. Just as I started to feel like I was moving forward, the past came back to test me. Mark's interference. One Saturday morning, as Irene and I were planning a quiet day with Alex, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, but when she did, her face paled. It was Mark. She put him on speakerphone so I could hear. His voice was calm, but laced with manipulation. "Irene, we need to talk. For Alex's sake." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice steady but strained. "You're being unreasonable," Mark replied. "I'm his father. You can't just shut me out." Irene clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. "You made your choice, Mark. And it wasn't us." Mark's tone turned colder. "You're poisoning him against me. If you keep this up, I'll take you to court for full custody." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Irene ended the call, her hands shaking as she set the phone down. "He's bluffing," she said, though her voice wavered. I wasn't so sure. Mark had always been good at manipulation, and if he saw a chance to exert control, he'd take it. Claire's last attempt. Not long after, Claire made her own dramatic move. I was at home when she showed up, unannounced, pounding on my door. When I opened it, she was standing there with a suitcase in hand. "Michael," she said, her eyes glassy with tears, "I've left Mark. I want to come home." I stared at her, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "I made a mistake," she said, stepping closer. "He was nothing compared to you. Please, let's try again." Her desperation was almost palpable, but I couldn't feel sympathy. "Not anymore. You expect me to forget everything you've done?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "The lies, the betrayal, the way you tried to blame me for your choices?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Michael. I am. I'll do anything to fix this." "Claire," I said, stepping back, "you can't fix this. It's over." Her tears turned to anger. "Is it because of her? That woman and her kid? You've replaced me, haven't you?" "This isn't about Irene," I said, though part of me knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's about you and the choices you made. Now, please leave." Claire stared at me for a long moment before turning and walking away. As I watched her go, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She had been a significant part of my life, but now she was just a chapter one needed to close. A threat to Irene. Just as Claire's drama subsided, Mark escalated his efforts. One evening, Irene called me in tears. He had shown up at her house unannounced, demanding to see Alex. "He was yelling," she said, her voice shaking. Alex was terrified. "I told Mark to leave, but he wouldn't. I had to call the police." My stomach tightened. "Is he gone now?"
"Yes," she said.
"But I'm scared, Michael. What if he comes back?" I drove over immediately, my protective instincts kicking in. When I arrived, Irene looked exhausted, her face pale, and her eyes red from crying. Alex clung to her, his small frame trembling. "You're safe now," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He won't hurt you." But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Mark wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. The breaking point. The next day, Irene and I met with her lawyer to discuss filing a restraining order. It was a necessary step, but it felt like another battle in an endless war. While we waited for the paperwork to be processed, Irene broke down. "I'm so tired, Michael," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm tired of fighting, of looking over my shoulder. I just want to protect Alex and move on." I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she sobbed into my chest.
"You're not alone," I said.
"We'll get through this together." That night, as Irene and Alex stayed at my house for safety, I realized how much they had come to mean to me. They weren't just people I was helping, they were becoming my family. A light in the darkness. Despite the chaos, there were moments of peace. Alex had a way of bringing light into even the darkest days, whether it was through his infectious laughter or the way he looked up to me like a hero. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Alex turned to me and said, "You make my mom smile again." I think she was sad before, but now she's happy. Irene's cheeks flushed, and she tried to brush it off, but I could see the gratitude in her eyes. In that moment, I realized something profound. My life, once shattered, was being rebuilt, not with the pieces of the past, but with something entirely new. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. The turning point came on an ordinary day. Irene and I were at the park with Alex, watching him race around the playground. The sun was warm on our backs, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely at peace. "You seem happy," Irene said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I think I am," I replied, surprised at the realization. It was true. The storm that had torn through my life was finally starting to clear. Claire's attempts to re-enter my life had fizzled out. The restraining order against Mark had been granted, and though he was still a looming figure in Irene's life, his power over her seemed to diminish with every step she took forward. I looked at Irene and saw the same determination and resilience that had carried her through the worst of it. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving, and her strength inspired me to do the same. The first step. That night, after we put Alex to bed, Irene and I sat on her couch, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. "I never thought I'd feel normal again," she said, staring into her mug. "But this feels good." "It does," I agreed. There was a pause, a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Then, almost without thinking, I reached out and took her hand. She looked up, her eyes wide but soft. "Irene," I said, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest, "you've been my anchor through all of this. I don't know where I'd be without you." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I could say the same about you." It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it didn't need to be. It was honest, simple, and exactly what we both needed. Building a life together. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship continued to grow. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was natural, like two pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. I started spending more time with Alex, helping him with homework, teaching him how to throw a baseball, and listening to his endless stories about dinosaurs and superheroes. Irene, meanwhile, encouraged me to dive back into woodworking. She even gave me space in her garage to set up a proper workshop. One weekend, we built a birdhouse together, laughing as Alex painted it bright purple with splashes of green. "Looks like a clown threw up on it," I joked. Alex grinned. "It's art." Irene laughed, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Facing the past. Of course, the past wasn't entirely behind us. Mark made one last attempt to reassert himself, showing up unannounced at Alex's school. Irene called me in a panic, and I rushed over, finding her trembling in the parking lot. "He didn't get near Alex," she said, her voice shaky. "But it scared me." I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her relax against me. "He won't win," I said firmly. "Not while I'm here." It was a promise I intended to keep. A fresh start. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like a completely different person. Claire had fought hard for a bigger share of the assets, but in the end, the truth worked in my favor. Irene's divorce was also finalized, and while the custody arrangement required her to allow limited supervised visits between Mark and Alex, she was relieved to have the court's backing in protecting her son. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching Alex chase fireflies, Irene turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What do you think about moving in together?" she asked. I blinked, surprised but not unprepared. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I've been thinking about it for a while. You're already such a big part of Alex's life, and mine. It feels right." I didn't need to think about it. "Let's do it," I said, a smile spreading across my face. A new family. The transition was surprisingly smooth. Alex was thrilled to have me around all the time, and Irene and I found a rhythm that felt like we'd been living together for years. We weren't just two people healing from heartbreak anymore. We were a family. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. As I watched Irene and Alex laughing together one evening, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life hadn't gone the way I'd planned, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this was better. We were building something real, something lasting. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.